Okay, thank you very, very much indeed. And Charles Allen is going to kick off with why Kipling is the greatest.
Jean, can I go to the subject?
Of course you can.
Thank you. When I heard there was going to be a vote, I decided I would nail my past and declare myself my allegiance. So I can put that there because, as in Hamlet, this is the image I want you to be aware of rather than the counterfeit. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm a huge fan of this young man, and I say young man is what I want to emphasise. That's not all. It's 4.5 minutes now. This young man, at the age of 23, this precocious imp, this taboo breaker, this freewheeling storyteller and boy poet, the anti-establishment champion of the underdog. All these have been overlaid by the old Kipling, all those brave activities of the young man. At the height of his fame, which was even before Orwell was born, and I do beg of us to remember that when we try to make comparisons. That Ruddy, at the height of his fame, about 901, Ruddy acquired a stalker. I don't think he's the first one. I think Byron had Lady Caroline Lamb, but basically he acquired a stalker who tried to shoot him twice. Had he succeeded, we would be mourning a literary giant, a great lost poet and storyteller. But Ruddy lived on, I'm sorry, I've got my glasses on, to become, in George Orwell's horrid phrases, the gutter patriot and the jingo imperialist. He became the hate figure of the left. That image of the busted imperial flush we owe in part to that miserable cold fish, that humbug, that snob, Eric Blair. That may not go down well. Ruddy Kipling and Eric Blair were both, of course, children of the Raj, but the India that Kipling returned to in the 1880s as a professional journalist. I'm sorry, this is very bad karma here. This was the Victorian Empire in excelsis. It was manifestly, in Curzon's phrase, the greatest force for good the world had ever seen, as was assumed at the time by those who were running the empire. The Burma, however, that Orwell, as Blair worked in the 1920s, was the Georgian Empire in decline. It was already in terminal descent. The cracks were all too apparent. And we should remember that when we think of Orwell working out there and we think of Kipling. And we look at the families, we see the same sort of thing. We have in the case of Ruddy Kipling, a Victorian family on the way up, a lower middle class family on the ascendant. And with Blair, we have the opposite. We have the upper middle class family on the way down. And the first family is entrenched, Ruddy Kipling's family, entrenched in a kind of, in the aesthetic movement. They were very much part of the aesthetic movement. The second, alas, entrenched in a kind of insular Philistinism, a failing family. Now, Ruddy Kipling, and I think most of us know this, but it's worth emphasising for those who don't, that he had the horror of being abandoned by his parents in a strange land at the age of 5 and being tortured mentally and physically by what he called that woman in the House of Desolation at Southsea. You may know a terrible story, Baba Blacksheep. He learned to hate, he learned to lie, but he turned that to advantage by indulging his imagination, and it failed to break him. I think that's what's remarkable. He emerged dyspraxic, myopic, stunted, but bumptious, ebullient, a prodigy rearing to go. Eric Blair's greatest drama that I've been able to find is an episode of bedwetting. There's something sad in that family. He is a damaged soul and stays a damaged soul, which is his tragedy. His headmaster's wife says of him, there was no warmth in him, and that lack of warmth stays with him, and I find it sad and somehow repellent. His closest acquaintance at Eton, Cyril Connolly, describes him as perpetually sneering, and that is something I find unpleasant about Orwell. And he actually says that Kipling is perpetually sneering, which I find very strange. And the other paradox of Orwell, when we know the later Orwell, or the Blair that becomes Orwell, is that he never challenges authority. He never actually seems to develop. The underdeveloped man is what he seems to stay for, really, till the end of his life, and I see that very tragic. Let's look at the writing, if I might compare and contrast. I thought it would be fun to look at the first published work we know from each of them, both at the age of 13. Here's Blair writing about the death of Kitchener, who was drowned at sea in 1914. No stone is set to mark his nation's loss, no stately tomb enshrines his noble breast, nor e'en the tribute of a wooden cross can mark this hero's rest. He needs them not, his name ungarnished stands, remindful of the mighty deeds he worked, footprints of one upon time's changeful sands, who ne'er his duty shirked. Ordered, disciplined, dull as mud. Now here's Rudyard Kipling writing about making mischief with his two great pals at his school. They become Stalky and Co, but he calls them the Dusky Crew. Our heads were rough and our hands were black with the ink stains midnight hue. We scouted all, both great and small. We were a dusky crew, and each boy's hand against us raised, against me and the other two. We chased the hare from his secret lair. We roamed the woodlands through. In parks and grounds far out of bounds wandered the dusky crew. And the keepers swore to see us pass, me and the dusky crew, etc., etc. So not ordered, not disciplined, but infused with passion, instinctive sense of rhythm, the pithy phrase. And so, not surprisingly, Ruddy's earliest ambition is to be a poet in London, to marry his girlfriend and become a famous poet. But at 16, what happens? He's summoned by his headmaster and he's told that his father has found a job for him in India. He is exiled to India. He hates it to begin with, but he makes the best of it. He throws himself into his job, he learns his craft, he churns out verses, which his editor refuses to let him publish, and he toes the imperial line initially. He fears Indian India. He fears it for its dirt and diseases, something he shares very much with Orwell. And the point I want to make is that he develops and changes. But in his 18th year, he's still an 18-year-old lad, he begins what he called his night walks. He leaves the comfort zone of imperial British India, the civil lines, and he goes into that danger zone, Indian India, in the city of Lahore. In E.M. Forster's words, he starts to connect, and he writes about what he connects with. I can read one tiny passage. I connect the dark and crooked and fantastic and wicked and awe-inspiring life of the native, the queer ways and works of the people of this land. I hunt and rummage among them, knowing Lahore City, that wonderful, dirty, mysterious anthill blindfold. I am in love with the country, and I find heat and smells of oil and spices and puffs of temple incense and sweat and darkness and dirt and lust and cruelty, and above all things wonderful and fascinating, innumerable. I make this point to show that the passion of the youngster and the way he is connecting with India and how he would be represented by people like Orwell. Yes, Ruddy does write about the Anglo-Indian society. He toes the line there. Duty and red tape, that famous phrase, picnics and adultery. But let's remember, he's also the first who actually dares to write about adultery among the British in India. Yes, he despises the Indian political agitators, just as, actually, ironically, so does Blair in Burma. But 40 years later, having said that, he despises the Hindu agitators, but he wants the Muslims to take over the country. He is a great fan of Islam. He also writes about, much more importantly, about love across the racial divide. He writes about the Indians themselves, some of those forgotten stories that we ignore. People like the hill woman Lisbeth, for example, whose story is the first he puts in Plain Tales from the Hills, his first book of stories. And he writes increasingly about the underdog, by which I mean the ordinary British soldier is a good example. The Tommy Atkins, that neglected figure. I think Andrew's going to mention it too. I must stop there. Compare and contrast. A man with no ambitions and a man full of passion and ambition. I better stop there because perhaps you'll have a chance later on to continue my diatribe. Thank you for listening.